Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Network 2020's webinar on what matters more, democracy or economic growth. And my name is Courtney Dogger, and I'm the president of Network 2020. It is a pleasure to have you all join us today with two really remarkable experts. So I think we are in for a real treat. This is the last briefing in our State of Democracy series, and I think it's probably one of the most interesting and thought-provoking that we will have. Really quickly, as background for those who are joining us for the first time, Network 2020 is an inclusive international community. We're really trying to bridge the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy sector. And we leverage entrepreneurial, emerging, and established leaders to try to highlight and drive innovative solutions to foreign policy challenges. So we do webinars like these. We also have a number of other programs that we do, including research and other educational programs. So please do check out our website and follow us on all of these social media. As background for tonight's briefing, from roughly the 70s through 2010, the number of democracies worldwide has grown incredibly. But as we have pointed out in this forum, and as has been pointed out in other places, democracy, liberal or otherwise, has also been on the decline in recent years. And as one of our speakers tonight has said, one of China's power is not just in that it is by any measure becoming the world's largest economy, but because it represents a different successful alternative to liberal democracy in some respects. And so tonight we wanted to grapple with the different models that appeal to different nations as they're on their own development trajectory. We are here with two of the foremost thinkers on democracy and economics. We have Professor Danny Quah, who is at the Kuan School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. And he is self-described as an economist who studies the supply and demand of world order. So on the one hand, what the international system and the world superpowers provide, and on the other, what is the world order that the global community needs. So he does some very interesting work in that respect. And we are also joined by Dr. Larry Diamond, who is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and at Stanford University. And he has written volumes, quite literally, that could fill a room on the democratization process. Just some of his work is listed below, but he really is a foremost expert on democratization and democracy. And so we are extremely lucky to have both of them join us today. So welcome, Dr. Diamond, welcome, Professor Quah. It's really an honor to have you here for what will prove to be, I think, an illuminating and thought-provoking conversation. I think that there will be some of what's discussed here today that will challenge many of our listeners on one spectrum or the other. So I really look forward to a good conversation. Starting with you, Dr. Diamond, against a backdrop of a rapidly growing world economy, a lot of empirical evidence suggests that democracy and democratization foster economic growth. And at the same time, we have this paradox that I referenced earlier of rapid economic development in the absence of Western-style democracy in China. So to start, what are the foundations of this debate? Is there a connection between democracy and economic growth, and how is this changing, or if it is changing?
Well, Professor Quah is the economist among us, so I think he could give you the perspective from economic theory better than I can. I would say at the broadest level, if you have suitable, they don't have to be perfect in my view, but obviously the better the policies, the better the outcomes. If you have suitable economic policies to mobilize capital and mobilize labor and mobilize technology and apply them to increase productivity, you're going to get economic development and growth. If you have good economic policies that, I would say ultimately give scope for the market to generate incentives for productivity, as China ultimately did, let's bear in mind that their miraculous economic growth, that entry into the 10%, annual economic growth era that they sustained for several decades, only began under Deng Xiaoping, when he abandoned pure communist policies and really allowed scope for the market and private ownership and investment. If you get that, if you have as big a market as China, so that lots of foreign investors feel they have to get access to it and bring money in, and if you have decent governance, I'd say you can get very good economic growth. And the bigger the market, the more people want to get access to it, the more your supply of cheap labor in the early years, the better the whole policy mix that Professor Quah could expand on, the more likely you are to get robust and even sustained economic growth. I want to say, in contrast to many of my kind of pro-democracy political science and even government colleagues, I've always been a little bit more cautious in making the instrumental claim for the superiority of democracy, because I know that which type of regime, democracy versus authoritarianism, is, quote, best for economic growth, can vary by historical period, can vary by region, and that any kind of prescription we could offer could always be countered by a different example. So I'll just close by saying the following. I think that Daron Acemoglu and some of his co-authors have provided persuasive cross-national evidence over a long period of time that there seems to be a long-term democracy advantage to economic growth. But it's undeniable that, Singapore, Korea, and Taiwan, well before the People's Republic of China, were able to use non-democratic institutions and very strong and effective states to achieve, pretty miraculous periods of economic growth, and still sustaining them in Singapore for it to become one of the, richest countries in the world. And the second thing that I will close with for the moment is that while I think there is a long-term democracy advantage, and while there clearly can be, in certain instances, an authoritarian, miraculous pathway to rapid economic growth, the claim that I feel most comfortable making is that for every China where you get miraculous economic growth, you've got a lot of Zimbabwe's and Venezuela's where authoritarian regime and the absence of state capacity and the absence of good governance have brought economic ruin. And so it also depends, I think, if I may say so, I think this is one of the lessons of Singapore is what's the rest of the package and what's the quality of governance that comes along with it.
Thank you. Professor Quah, turning to you, in one of your much watched TED Talks on economics, democracy, and the New World Order, you mentioned that it was really over the course of the global financial crisis of 2008, that was a turning point, and that it was the non-transatlantic axis that came to the rescue of the global economy at that time, and the subprime mortgage when everything really melted down. And that eventually resulted in a shift of the world's economic center of gravity. Can you explain a little bit more about why this shift happened? Was it happening pre-2008? And how might this shift challenge our assumptions about the relationship between liberal democracy and economic growth? And what does that mean going forward?
Thank you, Courtney, for that really interesting question. I hope my audio is coming through okay. I want to begin by saying what a great honor and privilege it is to be a part of this conversation with you, Courtney, with Larry Diamond, whose books I've read and studied. It's wonderful to be in this group of interlocutors, and I see from the audience a very interesting group generally. To address your question, the shift in the world's economic center of gravity is often used as a metaphor for what's happening in the world. And my small contribution, as it were, in that discussion that you referenced, is that I decided to make that metaphor literal. I actually calculated arithmetically the world's economic center of gravity, and I showed it was exactly as you described. There was a shift in it from its traditional center in the transatlantic region. The calculations show that for a large part of the 20th century, it was sitting at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, about halfway between North America and Western Europe, to no one's surprise. The shock value to that in the run-up to and following the 2008 global financial crisis was how that center of gravity, calculated arithmetically, mechanically, decided to lift itself up off the ocean floor and steadily tracked east. And by last year, it was probably east of the Middle East, east of Saudi Arabia. It's continued on its trajectory towards GMT +8, the time zone that I'm calling in from Singapore and the rest of East Asia. Now, to try and put that in perspective, I've tried to say that it was a very mechanical calculation. And the mechanics of it carry over into how we might at first think about how this came about. It came about because of the rise of China. It came about because of the continued economic strength of East Asia that Larry has described, even going pre-2008. So it's a combination of those things. And mechanically, there was nothing really very complicated. All of us, China, Singapore, Taiwan, Korea, everybody, we did export-oriented manufacturing. We leveraged economies of scale. We sold to large markets, not available domestically, not in the hinterland of Singapore. And given China's relative poverty at that time, its high population did nothing for its having a large market. All of us sold to the West, sold to the rich, advanced economies. And in doing this, we grew. We had we developed economies of scale, learning by doing. We got better at doing things. We advanced our technologies, and at the same time, we benefited the rich economies. We lowered price, increased affordability and availability on what the large markets wanted. So mechanically, that's the story. The interesting thing that you, Courtney, are pointing to, and that Larry has referenced already, is what was the political development going on at the same time? How was it related to the democratic systems that in the liberal West we might feel an essential part of how this development process is supposed to proceed? I have to confess, I am a great admirer of Daron Acemoglu and other economists who write about democracy and economic development. My own thinking on this might deviate slightly, but I don't think it's completely at odds with what a lot of other economists think. So I think we think of three things in terms of these large issues that we're discussing here. Okay. So first on the how all this development process impinges on our understanding of the democratic system. I think there are, as you said, Courtney, challenges. And I think of those two challenges as things that we're going to unpack in this conversation. But those two challenges come in primarily two leading forms. The first is, given this development in the economic landscape of the world, who is going to lead the world? See, pre-2008, traditionally, very clear answer to that. The West led economically, and so the West should lead geopolitically. The West should be the leaders of the world. This puts some wrinkle into that narrative that I think we're going to unpack as we go along. So let me just park that. The second large question about political systems is, does this mean that democracy is not the only pathway to economic success, given what Larry has described, given the success of China? And I think here we need to have a number of large ideas in mind. First, we should not be thinking democracy versus the other. It should not be a dichotomy. It should not be democracy versus totalitarianism. It should not be democracy versus authoritarianism. It should be democracy is one in a spectrum of political systems that work for some nations, don't work so well for others. How that divides up is the critical question on whether democracy is going to come back full-throated into the dominant political system everywhere in the world. And I think what we see, thinking along these three challenges that economists, I think about is, what is it that works for improving prosperity? Is it a magical formula, a black box that involves democracy? Or is this something more mechanical, like what I described earlier, export-oriented manufacturing, opening up global markets, having your system be open to competition? None of these things relies on democracy. They are part of what we see in many democratic systems, but they're part of what we see in many non-democratic systems. So that democracy should be viewed as essential is not a given, and that's something that all of us in this audience, all of us in this group might agree or disagree with. But it's something that seems to me the evidence asks us to open up as a possibility. The success of China should not be viewed as, oh, this is a totalitarian nation that grew. Shouldn't all the rest of us also be totalitarian so we can grow like China? That's not the right way to think about it. What China did was it opened up possibilities and showed us that there are multiple pathways to economic prosperity. Democracy is one of them, and the piling up evidence says that non-democracies, in a variety of ways, republicanism, polyarchies, responsive authoritarianism, accountable authoritarianism, all of these are shades of gray that might potentially work. Let me, if I may, Courtney, leave it as that, as the challenge, and then I hope that we'll come back and unpack some of these issues in greater detail. Back to you, please.
Of course, thank you very much. Dr. Diamond, picking up on a few of those threads and what you said earlier too about there's not necessarily a set process or a cookie cutter way of doing this. I wanted to dig into some current examples. Again, I'm sitting here in the United States. We've really sought to promote democracy and liberal values abroad for decades with this belief that democracy will lead to economic prosperity. However, I wanted to look at a country that Network 2020 has been focusing on recently, and that's Tunisia, which is an interesting case in that it was once hailed as the success story of the Arab Spring. Events of this summer when you had Kais Saied dismiss most of the government and then take over and start to rule by decree. That comes, but and that critical piece that I forgot to mention right now is that with much popular support from below, because there was this desire for stability and order, and because of a lack of improvement of economic conditions. And so I wanted to get your take on a case like Tunisia, and then just sort of how you would extrapolate from that in terms of a country's trajectory. If again, as Professor Quah said, there are many different models, and this idea has been opened up, I think, by the success of China. But would you say, is there a case to be made for democracy to follow economic stabilization and growth? How do you react to a case like Tunisia, and just extrapolating from that? What are you seeing when it comes to growth of authoritarianism?
Well, we've had a breakdown of democracy in Tunisia. It's still at a point of reversibility. You've had a populist illiberal president, Kais Saied, who has suspended the parliament and the constitution. He might still be induced to restore it, but it doesn't look like the convergence of international and domestic factors is pointing in that direction. The poor performance of the economy, and I'd say of the political system, has figured prominently in the breakdown of democracy in Tunisia. I do think it's important to put this in context. The democratic governments that emerged following the completion of the transition around 2012, 2013 have been weak, divided in a variety of ways. They've not been very effective. The old order, which is very corrupt, has reasserted itself in a very opportunistic way. So governance hasn't been particularly good. It's very important to understand so much of this is context sensitive. Every other country in the Arab world is a non-democracy, or was. Now Tunisia is as well. And the powerful ones in the region, the Gulf states, most especially Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and then once democracy, the proto-democratic experiment broke down in Egypt, the authoritarian regime of General al-Sisi in Egypt as well, were non-democracies. They viewed Tunisia as an existential threat to the security of their rule. If, in the same way that I think the Chinese leadership viewed the possibility of democracy in Hong Kong as an existential threat to its rule. If you have a successful model of democracy on your doorstep, not to mention inside your system in the case of China, it's a pretty dangerous thing in terms of people getting ideas that democracy might work in that part of the world. And let me just say that the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians did everything they possibly could to sabotage and undermine the Tunisian democratic experiment. Fortunately, a lot of the politicians in Tunisia gave them plenty to work with in that regard. So it's not a simplistic, monocausal determination. But it is important to note that the nearly 1 decade of democracy did not deliver for the people of Tunisia. The aid that Tunisian governments hoped would be forthcoming from the West economically also was not there. There are other instances where I'd say, new democracies on the African continent have performed better in maintaining order and delivering economic growth, in Ghana in particular. But even in former war-torn states like Liberia and Sierra Leone, a pretty unlikely state, one of the poorest in the world, in Malawi. And so, it really depends. I think what we're seeing is a period of a lot of variation, where some emerging democracies have done well, at least well for a period of time, or passably well in terms of economic performance, and others have been found wanting by their people. But then you have a lot of authoritarian regimes. I mentioned some, I could mention many others, where people have been horribly disappointed by the performance. And since they haven't had the ability to protest, all you can do in a place like Venezuela is vote with your feet, and 3 million Venezuelans have fled the country.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So very situational dependent. Professor Quah, it was recently announced that China's economic growth slowed last quarter to 4.9%. And there's this lying flat movement where young workers and professionals are opting out of what they see as a system of stress and overwork with little personal gain. So how might this slowing growth and these passive resistant movements factor into China's own evolution in terms of its economic growth and then in terms of what people want for their lives?
Thank you, Courtney. I mean, what you've described of developments in China are really interesting. And we also can't forget, we also want to bring into the conversation China's government moves against big tech. Its clamped down on high pressure tutoring, its attempt to reduce the stresses in the education system. And what you're referring to includes also taking a view on how much income inequality China reckons would be intolerable if it were to be exceeded. And many of these same issues are issues that challenge the advanced economies in the West. In the West, we're trying to get control of big tech. We're trying to get a sense of how income inequality has so torn apart the social fabric, the social compact, social cohesion that the West has enjoyed for so long under systems of liberal democracy. These are really challenging issues. And I think, when we think about those examples, and we think about the examples that Larry's mentioned in South America or in Africa, I think, we can't help but be filled with a sense of great tragedy and sadness that all these things are happening in the world. But I worry a little bit that if we place the blame of this on the doorstep of a failure for democracy to take root, we're asking for more than democracy can actually deliver. And we need to be cautious in how we do this. We want to set our expectations right. So in terms of the China discussion or the Tunisia discussion, what I come back to is I ask, what do these people want? Do they, at the end of it all, how do they feel that their society has been successful, economically or politically or otherwise? Is it prosperity and well-being? Is it at the end of their lives a sense of fulfillment, a sense that their life has been well lived, that they've had control over their lives? No one anywhere in the world goes around thinking, well, yeah, all those things are good things, but my society is at really low levels of basic nutrition. So what I need is a good dose of oppression and tyranny, muzzling of speech, so that my people are unable to contribute to local, national, social and political conversations. What I want is arbitrary control over my well-being, deprivation of my basic freedoms. If only we had that, then we'd escape basic poverty. No one in the world thinks that. No one in China ever thought that. No one in Tunisia, I hazard, would be thinking that. What people want is a feeling of control over their own destiny. And there are multiple ways in which they see they achieve that. What they want is a way in which their individual agency engages with the problems that the state solves, collective choice, collective action problems that make for a good society. And what people want is a sense that whatever social construct is put around them, there is space for them and their offspring and their families to advance in life, that they're not permanently excluded. There's not entrenchment of elites. And what we see around the world is different ways that they're experimenting to do that. On the China situation, it's tempting to say that because of this constellation of ideas, China is on the verge of a political convergence towards democracy. It's having to grapple with these same issues that everywhere else. It's no longer, this is a trajectory for economic growth and prosperity. Let's rush down this highway, forget everything else. It's tempting to say that China has reached a point where it's now going to think about the kinds of understanding of liberal values that in the West people have. And I suspect that what we're seeing is something much more complicated. It's complicated in the sense that China's government, China's politics is having to navigate an increasing diversity of voices. 30 years ago, let's urbanize, let's get the economy going. We're going to be lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Now, there's still some people in the West, in China, living on the edges of that poverty. And there are others on the East Coast in Beijing, Shanghai, tier 1 cities who say, you know what, we're well off. We're concerned about the skies that are polluted and unclear. We want better drinking water. We want a clean environment. And if holding back a rush on double-digit economic growth is the way to do it, let's consider that. So there's increasing diversity of views, and what's happening in the government is they're having to navigate that. And they're having to navigate that in a way that doesn't have recourse to the usual checks and balances mechanisms of Western-style liberal democracies. But I would argue they're not doing a terrible job at it. They've been able to reach a successful way forwards on carbon neutrality within the next few decades, on reaching peak carbon within this coming decade. Those are the same issues that in the West we've tried to use electoral systems to reach, but they've been able to get to these same points, mediating divided national political conversation. But it's not political convergence towards the structures and systems of liberal style democracy. And I think that the world has enough space in it for us to look at all these different models. It does take us back to one of the original questions that we began this conversation with, Cornelius, which is, as these changes occur and as different models show up in their multiplicity, is the world going to be led to clustering around a political system that is, for the moment, apparently at odds with Western-style liberal values? And I think those are possibilities that we need to be thinking about considering in a serious way, not dismissing as just, oh, that's the wrong end of the dichotomy between democracy and authoritarianism. Going down that road is a road to hell. It need not be. It depends on the political conversations we have across countries and within countries. Let me end with saying, there's a very awkward phrase that comes out of China, which is X, whatever X is, with Chinese characteristics, socialism with Chinese characteristics, democracy with Chinese characteristics. And it translated into the English, it's so awkward and terrible a phrase. It sounds a little bit arrogant. This is the way we are, we're not going to change. A different way to think about it, one that I think is closer to the Chinese text, is, you know what? This is the way we did it. This is how we built roads with Chinese characteristics. It's the way we did it. Nah, it might work for you, it might not, up to you. But here's how we did it. You think about it. It seems to me a fine way to think about alternative systems of political governance. Back to you, Courtney.
Thank you very much, Professor Quah. I'll try to get one or two more questions before turning to the Q&A box. And kind of jumping off from what Professor Quah just said about these idea of alternative systems and alternative ways of doing things. Turning to a little bit to leadership now, Dr. Diamond. President Biden has spoken about the clash between democracies and autocracies as a defining challenge of our time. And the first of 2 summits for democracies will take place this December. So in light of what Professor Quah just said, Dr. Diamond, I'm curious to get your take on this summit of democracies and this sort of binary that the Biden administration put out. What do you think is at stake here? What can the Biden administration accomplish through this summit, and how critical is it?
Well, I think the main thing that this virtual summit for democracy will do is call attention to the state of democracy in the world and launch a process for assessing the deficiencies of democracy and the pathways to reforming, deepening, and extending democracy. The way the Summit for Democracy has evolved as a 2-part phenomenon, beginning with the virtual gathering on December 8 and 9, and then a kind of year of action and reflection, followed by a second summit, could be a useful model in stimulating various dialogues, even like this one, and national plans to, again, reform and strengthen democracy. You know, a lot of what's going to emerge from the Democracy Summit is existing democracies saying, okay, we've got problems, we've got deficiencies, how can we become a better and better governed democracy? And I know the Biden administration is already thinking about and preparing its own kind of action plan for America to strengthen, reform, and reinvigorate democracy and repair some of the blights on our democracy in terms of racial injustice and the way our elections are administered and so on and so forth. All of that can be healthy. I think what's notable, Courtney, about the Democracy Summit is that it really is not a kind of in-your-face bipolarization of the world into a world of democracies or a free world and all those other bad states out there that should be excluded, berated, and punished. It's winding up taking a different approach. I would just like to say that I think beyond the Democracy Summit, what is needed now, and beyond the work that democracies must do to improve their institutions, improve their economies, strengthen their patterns of governance. Professor Quah was maybe a little too polite in talking about the 2008 financial crisis. Let's be honest with ourselves in acknowledging where it exploded in the United States and why rot and misgovernance in our financial sector. There's nothing inevitable about that in a democracy, but we have a lot of soft corruption in our lobbying and regulatory systems that enabled that to happen. We haven't adequately addressed it. Beyond all this, I think we are entering a world where there will be, again, a pretty serious normative debate. We're in a way already having it here, although it's more empirically grounded, about desirable political systems. And again, yes, I agree with Professor Quah. It's not just a binary choice, democracy versus autocracy. It's what properties of governance do we want? And in the end, this is really what he was saying when he was sounding almost like Amartya Sen, if I may say so. What is the good society? And I actually am much more hopeful about the ability of the United States to win this debate. Not the United States, the liberal democracies of the world. And I say this because I have seen survey data from the People's Republic of China that shows, particularly among younger people, interesting levels of aspiration for more self-determination. He talked about control of government, more societal control of government, more openness, more accountability, and more scope for individual self-determination. And I do think it's the case that once societies reach certain levels of prosperity and education and so on, that people want something more than just more wealth. They want more scope for human dignity and self-determination. And I think the PRC is headed into a period of difficulty in terms of meeting this challenge, which is why I think they are embarked on such an intense campaign under Xi Jinping to reassert political control and to construct, as they're starting to do. It's the other side of the war on the tech entrepreneurs and the quest to control their data in Orwellian surveillance state, which they're in the process of building. And a lot of people are quietly voting with their feet to exit that system or hedge their bets. So I think we are going to be in a period of renewed and quite valid, quite productive, normative debate about overarching values and what is the good form of government. And unfortunately, I think neither the United States in general, nor certainly Europe, nor the Biden administration currently has quite grabbed the horns of that debate in a way that I think could be done.
Thank you very much. Very powerful explanation. I am going to turn to the Q&A box now. So if you have any questions and you're listening, please do put them in the Q&A box and I will see what I can get to. And so this first one, Professor Quah, is for you. I'm going to read it verbatim, so I apologize if any information in this is inaccurate. So the questioner asks, Kishore Mahbubani has posited that the United States has weaponized the US dollar, which not only jeopardizes one of its greatest global strategic assets, but also leaves an unparalleled opportunity open for other countries to benefit from. Could the RMB or a different form of currency ever replace the US dollar as the dominant global reserve currency in the near future? And if this privilege were to switch hands, how might such a transition impact the power reputation of democracy worldwide?
Thank you, Courtney, for that question, and the member of the audience who asked that question. This is going to be a hugely important issue in systems of global governance going forwards. And changes in the world reserve currency, the identity of the world reserve currency, are infrequent. Last time it happened was when world leadership was handed over from the United Kingdom, from Great Britain to the United States. And even there, the United States had exceeded in gross domestic product, in national income, Great Britain 70 years before that transition actually occurred. Even when the United States was already the world's greatest economic and political power, there was a lot of persistence in holding on to pound sterling as the reserve currency. Now, who gets to be the nation that issues the world's reserve currency does get to exercise a great deal of economic power. People borrow in your currency, transactions are held in your currency, you get to collect seniorage from the people who are holding your currency, you get to, as my good friend Kishore says it, the previous dean, former dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School, said it, if you sought to, you could weaponize that currency and use it, manipulate it to achieve security and foreign policy goals, not just economic ones. And that is that separation that is tricky. I think towards the end of the time when pound sterling was the world's reserve currency, Britain held that tendency in check. The United States seems not to have done so. So when you do that, you naturally drive people away from wanting to hold your currency, use your currency as the medium of exchange. How this pans out, we see two competing forces. One, the tendency for the world's largest, greatest, most dynamic, most powerful economy, whichever that is, to be identified with the nation that issues the world's reserve currency. History tells us those two need not be the same, but there's a tendency in that direction. There's a pull force that makes for the world to gravitate towards China as it continues its economic dynamism. And there's a push factor. The more the United States manipulates the US dollar to achieve its self-seeking foreign policy goals, the less people are going to want to rely on that economic instrument, because that means that you get drawn into these foreign policy challenges, which are not part of your business, which are not your business. So there's both push and pull moving in the same direction. But these things historically have taken a long time. But when they do occur, the switch is quite sudden. My friend Adam Posen at the Peterson Institute has done studies documenting the drastic, rapid change once the world decides to move world reserve currency. So that's something that the United States will need to watch out for. If I may, can I use this opportunity to speak a little bit to some of Larry's points a few minutes ago, which I
Certainly.
completely agree with, if I may. So I completely agree with. And I would perhaps go even further. The world needs leadership. If the world ends up rejecting liberal democracy, it's not because the world feels that we don't want the United States as leader. The world needs effective, benevolent leadership to solve the grand, great global existential challenges of our time. Global pandemic, global climate crisis, extreme violence across nations. No one is happy with that. No one says, oh, it'd be great if someone could solve it, but no, that's a democratic country. I don't want a democratic country solving the problem of international terrorism. Nobody says that. We just want solutions. And if America can come up with solutions in a way that does not fracture the world into camps, more power to it. If somebody else wants to step forward, has the capacity and the economic and geopolitical goodwill to do that, let's give them a try as well. But nothing should be taken for granted. And I think that, Biden has a difficult landscape to navigate, because we can't forget the long shadow that the 4 years of the Trump administration has inflicted on America and the world. Biden has to deal with the spillover from that, and with 74 million Americans who voted for Trump, more than voted for Barack Obama in any election, voted for Trump in the last presidential elections. Biden's set of liberal values, together with navigating that fractured landscape, is going to make for, I think, a tortured conversation as he tries to make the United States again the benevolent, effective leader of the world. But nothing can be taken for granted. Thanks very much. Back to you, please.
Thank you. Dr. Diamond, turning to you, we have a question from Arlette Laurent, who was the former Chargée d'Affaires of the EU to the UN. And she asks, do you think one can promote democracy where the fundamental foundations for it do not exist? And alternatively, can or should countries enjoying higher standard of living give targeted aid, health, education, agrarian reforms to developing countries, including help in promoting institutional and legal frameworks conducive to democratic behavior, such as sending observers to elections? So can we promote democracy where the fundamental foundations do not exist? And should we be engaged in this promotive behavior?
Well, to the first question, I would say a qualified yes, actually, which might surprise her if depending on what you mean by promote. What I mean by promote is encourage, foster, support, assist the development of, not sell, impose, or certainly not invade a country to impose. So promoting democracy in the classical sense we used to talk about, of a democracy assistance and support. And I say yes, that can be done where the fundamental foundations for it do not exist, because we have a number of instances. The further you go down the ladder of national poverty, the more unusual the circumstances are, but we do have a number of instances where the fundamental foundations for democracy, the social foundations of economic prosperity, high levels of education, a middle class, a very capable state, a strong, overarching national identity. To be honest, these, what used to be called conditions for democracy, did not exist. And yet, as a result of development, of a certain kind of development, they came to exist, so that the country developed through democracy rather than seek, which is Amartya Sen's appeal, that that is a pathway to national development, is not the sequence of a benevolent authoritarian state building, economic prosperity and then democracy, which was, let's say, the Korean and Taiwanese pathway, but rather development through democracy. I think Botswana is the most successful case of this. Costa Rica is kind of another, but there have been others. We thought, Sri Lanka might be, but, look what's happened to it. And we do see now a number of sub-Saharan African countries that show promise in this regard. I'd say the more forthcoming is international assistance that is, yes, targeted on investments in human well-being and health and education and agrarian reform and productivity, the more likely that is to work. And I'm a big fan of the Millennium Challenge account, where we provide positive incentives toward good governance. We don't withdraw aid from countries because, and thereby punish people necessarily because they don't meet our governance expectations, but where governments are committing to do better in terms of investing in people, opening up their markets, and improving their qualities of governance, then we add more aid to that. And the aid is added in a way that generates a compact with the people, a public dialogue on how the money should be spent, and monitorable guideposts for assessing the effectiveness of those public investments. So I'd like to see more aid follow that kind of logic.
Thank you. Professor Quah, one question for you. You've mentioned both in previous talks and then also tonight about this idea that that there could be another benevolent leader on the world stage, and it doesn't necessarily need to be the US, but the world benefits from having leadership, particularly in a time when we're facing pandemics and climate change and a lot of other global issues. What would that look like?
A multi-trillion-dollar question, Courtney. I think it's wonderful to state the problem and admire its beauty and its efficacy. I don't think at this point anybody has a view on how to solve that challenge. Part of it might be a move towards a more multipolar world rather than a unipolar one, where the United States is right in the center and is so powerful in every single dimension, it gets to decide everything. Making collective decisions for the world is an order of magnitude more difficult than making collective decisions for the societies that we live in. But societies that we live in, we stumble along. Some of us have governments whose political leaders we view as almost as family members, as benevolent family members, as sometimes China is viewed. In others, we view our political leaders in an adversarial way. As long as they're responsible and accountable, that's okay, but they're also disposable, which in a way is sometimes how liberal democracies treat their leaders rather shabbily, I think. We have a multiplicity of experiments that human societies are trying to work with. And there's an even larger experiment, how we view leadership and organization in the world. But I think that if there's one organizing principle I want to have, it is that 80% of the world lives outside the United States and China. If the world is democratic in a way that I think both the United States and the People's Republic can agree, that it should do things to serve people, it should do things to serve the majority of the people, this 80% has to be brought into the conversation. We cannot have a global leadership contest simply between the two greatest powers in the world. We need to have everybody have a say. And I think the last 70 years have been attempts to build that inclusiveness, but we're a long way away from a satisfactory account on that. So I think we need to move in that direction. Thank you, Connie.
Thank you, Professor Quah. And we have just about a minute left. Dr. Diamond, any reactions to that? The role of democracies in a multipolar world, what do you see?
Well, I first of all think we need to reform the United Nations. Kofi Annan tried to do that with the panel of eminent persons he appointed, but it just got mired in big party politics. The Security Council, in particular, the UN Security Council, is deeply in need of reform, at least to bring on some permanent members like India, who would broaden that that global governance, realm, the kind of internal core of global governance. Beyond that, yeah, I'd say absolutely. I mean, the days are over when there was or could be a bipolar or unipolar world with the US really kind of in command. And really the new strategy that I think the United States must pursue is collaboration at two levels. Global collaboration, as we're hopefully going to achieve some of, but I'm not very optimistic at COP26 in Glasgow on the biggest threat confronting humanity, which is climate change. But Professor Quah rightly noted pandemics, and there are others. And then cooperation among, I'd say, pluralistically governed countries. I'm not even using the word democracy now, to try and meet the challenge of spreading authoritarianism, and to try to prevent the emergence of a regional or global hegemon who doesn't believe in pluralism and the kind of founding liberal values of the UN system. And I think China does aspire to be such a hegemon, and therefore there's an important role, not for a new Cold War, I really do not favor that, but for coalitional activity. The Quad is one element of coalitional activity, but it's only one of several. I think ASEAN, I know Professor Quah won't disagree with this, is an immensely important grouping. And we can't use it as a battering ram or a containment realm against the rise of the PRC. But I think we can approach it respectfully, open-mindedly, to take a place of engagement with it in the same way the PRC will have a place of engagement with it, and basically say, okay, in what I consider to be the real center of gravity in the world economy now, which is the Indo-Pacific, there's a new order, there's a new distribution of power, and our goal should be to not have any hegemon.
Thank you. That is a wonderful place to close. Our aim really in having this discussion was to illuminate some of the many ways in which people worldwide are really looking at life and livelihoods and governance, and how they can really achieve the best possible lives for themselves. Because as you both mentioned, that really does seem to ultimately be the goal, and maybe there are different pathways there. It has been a real privilege and honor to speak to both of you tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. It really, truly was an honor. So thank you very much. For those of you who might want to join future discussions, our next event is on November 8th. This is our open one. We have a private member-only event as well, but our next open one is on ruling space, governance, security, and commerce. So please do feel free to join us for that, and feel free to invite friends and colleagues, because these are free and open to everyone around the world. So Dr. Diamond, Professor Quah, thank you so much. It really has been an honor. Thank you.
Thank you both. Great pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.